Somewhere out there, a grown adult once called 911 because their sandwich didn't have enough mayonnaise. It's the perfect snapshot of our species. Infinite technology, zero common sense. And trust me, the Mayo incident? That's just the warm-up act. 1. A woman once called 911 because her chicken nuggets weren't cooked right. Not because she was choking on them, not because they were poisoned. No, because she didn't like them. She demanded the police make McDonald's fix it. Somewhere, an operator with a college degree had to say the words, "Ma'am, undercooked nuggets are not a police matter." Imagine dialing emergency services over poultry. That's not a 911 call. That's a cry for adult supervision. It's like calling the FBI because your Starbucks spelled your name wrong. Honestly, if Darwin were still around, he'd hang up his notebook and just point at this woman as proof his theory was correct. 2. A man in Ohio once dialed 911 because his wife took his beer. That's it. No violence, no threat. Just a cold one that wasn't cold anymore. He told dispatchers she was holding it hostage. I'm sure the SWAT team was on the edge of their seats, preparing to breach the fridge. The dispatcher asked if it was an emergency, and he said, "It is to me." That's the kind of logic that should come with an ankle monitor and a breathalyzer. The only hostage situation here was his dignity, and it didn't survive the night. 3. Someone in Florida, of course it was Florida, called 911 because a police officer arrested them for drunk driving, and they wanted to report that as a crime against them. They literally called 911 from the back of the squad car to say, "This officer is being mean to me." That's like calling customer service on Gravity. There's dumb, and then there's filing a formal complaint against reality. If you're dialing emergency services because consequences showed up, congratulations, you are now the emergency. 4. A man once called 911 because a squirrel was eating his pumpkin too aggressively. Apparently, the rodent wasn't just nibbling, it was staring at him while doing it. Look, buddy, the squirrel didn't invade your home, steal your car, or hack your Netflix. It's just having lunch. But no, he described it as a hostile act. Somewhere there's a police report that basically reads, "Subject intimidated by squirrel." That's the kind of story you tell your grandchildren if your goal is to make them lose all respect for you. 5. A woman called 911 because her roommate stole her snow. You heard that right, her snow, as in frozen water from the sky. She claimed the neighbor shoveled her snow onto their driveway like it was intellectual property. She wanted an officer to come and make them put it back. I'm not sure what kind of training prepares you for that. Maybe a PhD in kindergarten logic. I imagine the officer standing there, surrounded by melting evidence, wondering how long before the planet gives up on us entirely. 6. A man called 911 because he was trapped in his car. The doors were locked, the windows were rolled up, the keys were in the ignition. And yes, the car was running. He just didn't realize all he had to do was pull the handle. Dispatch had to calmly explain, "Sir, have you tried unlocking the door?" There was a pause, followed by, "Oh, yeah, it works now." Somewhere, a dispatcher quietly updated their resume that night, because once you've coached an adult through opening a door, you've peaked professionally. 7. Someone called 911 because Taco Bell ran out of tacos. The level of betrayal must have been biblical. He said he paid good money and demanded the police force them to make more. I can only imagine the dispatcher's face, somewhere between despair and secondhand embarrassment. This man thought the national emergency system was basically Yelp with sirens. When your biggest tragedy involves a missing chalupa, you don't need a police officer. You need perspective and possibly a salad. 8. A guy in California once called 911 because he couldn't find his TV remote. Not stolen, just lost. He said he didn't want to miss the game. That's not an emergency, that's a commercial break. The dispatcher told him 911 is for life-threatening situations. He replied, "It's the Super Bowl," which, fair, but still, no. Somewhere, an operator was probably whispering, "Sir, the only thing dying here is your brain cells." If this man ever goes missing, I hope someone calls ESPN, not the police. 9. A woman called 911 because she didn't like the color of her mugshot. Yes, she called after being booked. Apparently, she thought she could get a redo. She said the lighting was bad, and she didn't have time to do her hair. The dispatcher gently reminded her that glamour shots aren't standard police procedure. It's not a photo shoot, it's an arrest. Imagine being so committed to vanity that you treat jail like an influencer brand deal. Hashtag justice, but make it fashion. 10. Someone once called 911 because their Wi-Fi was down. They described it as a complete outage emergency. When dispatch told them to contact their provider, they said, "No, this is bigger than that. I can't work, I can't stream, I can't even think." Honestly, I get it. Losing Wi-Fi does feel apocalyptic. But unless your router is holding someone hostage, the police are not rebooting it. If civilization collapses, it'll start with someone calling 911 because Netflix buffered. 11. A man once called 911 to complain that the traffic light was taking too long. He'd been sitting there for 2 minutes and decided that was enough to involve law enforcement. He told dispatch he suspected corruption. Yes, he thought the traffic light was corrupt, like it was personally conspiring against him. Somewhere, the dispatcher probably muted the call just to laugh. When you start assigning criminal motives to stoplights, it's not traffic, it's time for therapy. 12. A woman once called 911 because her neighbor's dog looked at her weird. She said the dog was plotting something. Dispatch asked what exactly the dog was doing, and she said just sitting there, but suspiciously. Congratulations, ma'am. You've just accused a golden retriever of terrorism. The only thing that dog was plotting was when to nap next. If paranoia were a sport, she'd be in the Olympics. 13. A man called 911 to ask if it was illegal to own a tiger. The dispatcher said yes. He said, "Oh, okay," and hung up. 10 minutes later, the same man called again, this time because his tiger escaped. You can almost hear the operator sigh before typing. Caller was warned. Look, if your day ends with a tiger loose in your neighborhood, maybe skip the legal consultation phase and go straight to running. 14. A woman once called 911 because she forgot her Facebook password. She said she was locked out of her life. The dispatcher, somehow keeping a straight face, explained that Mark Zuckerberg does not dispatch officers. She insisted it was urgent because someone might be tagging her in ugly photos. Honestly, I'd like to live in that kind of bubble, where social media inconvenience equals national crisis. If we ever have another blackout, I guarantee someone's first instinct will be to call the cops on Instagram. 15. A man once dialed 911 because his drug dealer shorted him. He said, "I gave him $60 and got half the product." The dispatcher, probably blinking in disbelief, asked, "What exactly did you buy?" He answered, "Meth." That's right, he confessed to buying illegal drugs to the police. The operator just told him, "We'll send someone." And I hope they did. Just not the kind of someone he was expecting. If stupidity were a crime, this guy would be serving life without parole. 16. Someone called 911 because their Uber driver looked suspicious. The reason? He had facial hair. That's it. She described it as a terrorist beard. The dispatcher asked, "Ma'am, is he threatening you?" She said, "No, but he's got that look." So basically, this woman weaponized her own bias and made it everyone else's problem. The only emergency here was her personality. Somewhere, that poor driver's just trying to make rent while being treated like a Bond villain. 17. And my personal favorite, a man called 911 because his girlfriend changed the Netflix password. He said she locked him out of his account and demanded officers restore justice. He even claimed emotional damage. I guess modern heartbreak doesn't come from cheating. It comes from losing access to your watch list. The dispatcher told him that wasn't a crime, and he said it should be. Honestly, he's not wrong. But if you're calling 911 because your ex pulled a digital heist on Bridgerton, maybe you're not ready for love. Or Wi-Fi. 18. A woman once called 911 because she locked herself inside her car. Not her keys, herself. She said the power locks malfunctioned and she couldn't get out. Dispatch tried very politely to explain that there was a manual latch on the door. She said, "I tried everything." After 10 minutes of coaching, she finally pulled the handle and screamed, "It worked!" like she just solved quantum physics. Somewhere, an officer probably retired early that day, realizing there's no point enforcing laws when people can't enforce basic logic. This woman didn't need police. She needed a manual titled Doors, A Beginner's Guide to Freedom. 19. A man once called 911 to complain that the bar stopped serving him. He said it was discrimination. The dispatcher asked if he was intoxicated, and he said, "Well, not anymore." He wanted the police to forced the bartender to keep pouring. That's not a 911 call, that's a cry for a liver transplant. Imagine an officer showing up, badge flashing, saying, "You're under arrest for not refilling this man's margarita." Some people don't need an ambulance, they need a designated babysitter. 20. Someone once called 911 to report a suspicious bag on the street. Cops rushed over expecting a bomb. It was filled with bagels. The caller insisted they didn't trust the smell. Yeah, probably that dangerous scent of sesame and gluten. The officer said, "It's just breakfast." The caller said, "That's what they want you to think." I'm not sure who they are, but apparently the carb industry is running a covert operation. Somewhere in a government archive, there's a report that reads, "Code Brown, Bagel Scare 2018. 21. A man in Georgia called 911 because his phone wouldn't stop autocorrecting him. He claimed it was possessed and sending demonic texts. The operator told him to turn it off and on again. He said, "That's what the phone wants me to do." Look, if you think your smartphone is plotting your downfall, maybe you shouldn't own one. He said, "It told me to buy cheese." Honestly, if the devil is sending you grocery suggestions, you might not be cursed. You might just be lactose intolerant. 22. A woman once dialed 911 to ask if it was okay to keep a raccoon as a pet. The dispatcher said no. 5 minutes later, she called back because it bit her. She sounded shocked, like the wild animal she trapped in her kitchen wasn't properly socialized. The officer had to explain rabies protocol while she kept saying, "But he was smiling." Ma'am, that wasn't a smile. That was nature's version of "get away from me." Raccoons are not Disney sidekicks, they're fuzzy chaos in a fur coat. 23. Someone called 911 because their pizza delivery was taking too long. They said it had been over an hour and they suspected a crime. The dispatcher asked, "What kind of crime?" They replied, "Fraud." Look, I get hangry too, but unless your pepperoni's been kidnapped, it's not an emergency. The police actually showed up just to make sure the caller wasn't dying. They were of boredom. Imagine wasting public resources because Papa John betrayed you. That's not criminal behavior. That's dinner plans gone sad. 24. A guy in Nevada once called 911 because he wanted to know if he was too drunk to drive. The dispatcher told him yes. He said, "But you haven't even seen me yet." Then he offered to come down to the station to prove it. They said, "Please don't." He did anyway. He arrived 5 minutes later, in his car. Congratulations, sir. You just answered your own question and earned a free night in jail. The IQ on this one? Lower than his blood alcohol content. 25. A woman once called 911 because her husband wouldn't stop passing gas. She described it as aggressive flatulence and said she couldn't take it anymore. The dispatcher, probably one complaint away from quitting forever, gently told her to open a window. She said, "That's not enough. Lady, unless your husband's diet just became a chemical weapon, this is not law enforcement territory. Somewhere in that marriage, love died, probably suffocated." 26. Someone once called 911 because there was a suspicious man with a flashlight outside their home. Officers arrived. It was their meter reader. The homeowner was furious, saying he didn't announce himself. What do they expect? An electric company town crier shouting, hear you, I'm here to check your voltage." The poor worker's just trying to do his job, not reenact Shakespeare in the driveway. Honestly, the most dangerous thing about him was his reflective vest. 27. A man in Oregon once called 911 because his girlfriend's cat wouldn't let him leave the house. The dispatcher could hear the cat hissing in the background while the man whispered, "It's blocking the door." Police arrived to find him perched on a chair, terrified. The cat just sat there, unimpressed. You know you've hit rock bottom when law enforcement has to negotiate with a house pet. I'd say the cat won that standoff, and probably got extra treats for it. 28. Someone called 911 to complain that a restaurant charged them for too much guacamole. They wanted police to investigate the overcharge. The dispatcher explained that's not fraud, it's called dining out. They said, "It's $3 for a scoop. That's criminal." You know what's criminal? Calling emergency services over avocado pricing. Somewhere out there, an EMT probably raced past a real emergency so Karen could argue about salsa. If guac were a felony, every Chipotle would be a maximum security prison. On 29. A man once called 911 because he saw a UFO hovering above the park. Police arrived to find a drone. He said, "It followed me home." The officer said, "That's because it's yours." Turns out, the man forgot he'd bought a drone earlier that day. That's not extraterrestrial activity, that's just advanced stupidity. The aliens probably heard that call and decided Earth wasn't worth invading. 30. A woman once called 911 because she couldn't find her car in the parking lot. The dispatcher asked, "Are you sure it was stolen?" She said, "No, I just can't remember where I put it." That's not a crime, that's Target. We've all been there. But most of us don't turn it into a federal investigation. The police found her car in the next aisle over. She cried tears of joy. Honestly, they should have towed the license plate and left her with a bus pass. 31. Someone called 911 to report suspicious noises coming from their attic. They thought it was a burglar. It was a raccoon. But here's the twist. It was their pet raccoon. They forgot they owned one. They said, "I thought he ran away." The cop said, "He didn't. He's been living rent-free." Imagine being so oblivious you accidentally swat your own animal. At this point, the raccoon deserves legal ownership of the house. 32. A man once called 911 because his GPS told him to drive into a lake, and he did. He said, "It said to turn left." That's not navigation, that's natural selection. The dispatcher asked if he could swim. He said, "Not well." Look, when your map app says, "Take the next turn," maybe check if it leads to water. Somewhere, his phone was probably recalculating his IQ. 33. Someone once called 911 because their Roomba was acting suspicious. It was moving weird and following them. The officer arrived to find a robotic vacuum doing exactly what it was designed to do: clean. The owner said, "It's staring at me. Unless you've installed eyes on it, that's paranoia with a power cord." They unplugged it. Problem solved. Somewhere, the Roomba's still plotting revenge, probably by bumping into their ankles at 3 a.m. 34. And finally, a man called 911 because he couldn't find his phone. The operator calmly said, "Sir, you're calling me on it." There was a pause, long enough to feel the universe sigh, and then he said, "Oh." I like to think the dispatcher just hung up and stared into the void for a minute, wondering how humanity ever survived this long. We have technology that can map the stars, cure diseases, and translate languages, and we still have people accidentally reporting themselves to 911. Evolution, at this point, is just taking a smoke break. 35. A woman once called 911 because her horoscope told her something bad was going to happen, and she wanted officers to stand by. The dispatcher, now spiritually broken, explained that astrology is not grounds for emergency response. She replied, "But Mercury is in retrograde," as if that was the legal code for panic. Somewhere, a cop probably flipped through his training manual looking for Section 7B, Planetary Misalignment Protocol. The bad thing that happened wasn't cosmic. It was this phone call. When the stars predicted chaos, they weren't wrong. They just underestimated how fast humans could dial. 36. A man in Wisconsin once called 911 because he needed a ride to his court hearing. For drunk driving, the operator asked if he understood the irony, and he said, "Yeah, that's why I'm being responsible." Yes, calling the police for a free chauffeur to your own sentencing. What could possibly go wrong? Officers arrived, gave him a ride all right, straight to jail. It's like Uber, except the fare is your freedom, and the tip is a court fine. You almost have to admire that level of misplaced confidence. Almost. 37. Someone called 911 because there was a suspicious man jogging in their neighborhood. The suspicious activity? Exercising. The caller said, "He's moving too fast to be casual." Yeah, how dare someone use their legs in public? The dispatcher asked if the jogger was doing anything illegal, and the caller said, "Not yet." Somewhere, an officer was forced to explain that fitness isn't a felony. If running scares you that much, maybe your real emergency is a mirror. 38. A woman once called 911 because she didn't want to go to work. No threat, no sickness, just pure laziness. She said she was emotionally unavailable for capitalism. Honestly, I felt that in my soul. The dispatcher asked what she wanted police to do, and she said, "Arrest me, so I don't have to clock in." Somewhere out there, this woman is a folk hero. She didn't just call in sick, she called in state intervention. That's not unemployment. That's performance art. 39. A man once called 911 because his neighbor's snowman was looking at him funny. When officers arrived, they found a perfectly normal Frosty with two coal eyes. The man insisted the snowman was mocking him. They told him to go back inside. He said, "I won't be intimidated by frozen trash." You know you've hit a societal low when the police have to mediate between a human and a seasonal decoration. If snowmen could talk, that one probably whispered, "Buddy, I'm embarrassed for both of us." 40. A woman once called 911 because her Uber driver refused to let her vape in the car. She said it was her right to relax. The dispatcher explained that no, it was not, in fact, a constitutional amendment. She kept saying, "It's just vapor," as if the police were waiting to raid Uber for crimes against nicotine. It's incredible. We used to call 911 for fires. Now we call because we can't make one. Somewhere, the founding fathers are looking down, whispering, "Delete this experiment." 41. Someone once called 911 to report suspicious smoke in their apartment. Firefighters raced over, only to find burnt popcorn. The caller said, "It smelled dangerous." It did. It smelled like unemployment and sadness. The crew aired out the apartment while the caller stood there, clutching their microwave like it had betrayed them. If there's ever a museum of human error, that bag of popcorn deserves a wing. Exhibit A. How to waste taxpayer money in under 2 minutes and 30 seconds. 42. A man once called 911 to complain that his psychic didn't predict his arrest. He said she scammed him because she didn't warn him about the police. The dispatcher told him, "Maybe that's because you're calling from jail." This guy's level of self-awareness was somewhere between goldfish and brick. He genuinely thought the crime wasn't the issue. The poor customer service was. Sir, if your psychic couldn't foresee this, maybe that's because she saw you coming. 43. A woman once called 911 because a store clerk looked at her with attitude. That's not a crime. That's retail. She told dispatch. He rolled his eyes, and they said, "Ma'am, that's not illegal." She said, "It should be." I agree, but only for her. Somewhere, there's a minimum wage worker just trying to survive the shift while someone weaponizes 911 like Yelp. We don't need more police. We need a national sarcasm registry. 44. A man once called 911 because he thought his neighbor was harboring an alien. The alien turned out to be a Roomba vacuum with glowing LED lights. The officer said, "Sir, that's a cleaning robot." He said, "That's what they want you to think." This man was one firmware update away from joining a cult. Honestly, if aliens do come, I hope they beam him up first, just for the anthropological experience. 45. Someone called 911 because they lost their fries at a drive-thru. They wanted police to make McDonald's give them new ones. When the dispatcher asked if there was a threat, they said, "Yeah, to my lunch." Look, I love fries as much as the next person, but this is how society collapses. One potato at a time. Somewhere, a paramedic was racing toward an actual heart attack while this person reported a missing starch. Priorities: deep fried and completely lost. 46. A woman once called 911 because her Roomba trapped her in the bathroom. Apparently, it kept bumping the door and she was too scared to open it. The dispatcher asked if it was aggressive. She said, "It's persistent." Officers arrived to free her from a vacuum cleaner. We have AI that can write essays, and yet humans are still losing hostage negotiations to appliances. The robots aren't taking over. They don't need to. We're surrendering voluntarily. 47. Someone once called 911 to report that their neighbor wasn't recycling correctly. Not a fire, not a crime, just bad sorting habits. They described it as environmental negligence. The dispatcher said, "That's not illegal." They said, "It should be." This is what happens when people run out of hobbies. The officer showed up to find the recycling bin perfectly normal. The caller said, "Well, maybe they hid the glass." This isn't activism. It's boredom with a badge. 48. A man once called 911 to report that a vending machine stole his money. When officers arrived, they found him shaking it violently. He told them, "I'm just collecting evidence." Yeah, evidence of stupidity in progress. They told him to step away from the machine. He said, "Not until I get my Doritos." Somewhere in the report it probably says, subject believed snack was sentient. Justice was not served, but a bag of chips eventually was. 49. A woman once called 911 because her boyfriend proposed, and she wasn't ready. She said she needed police to remove him. The dispatcher asked if he was threatening her. She said, Emotionally, yes. That's not a crime. That's romance in 2025. The guy was just standing there, ring in hand, while officers arrived to separate them. Congratulations. You've officially turned happily ever after into a police report. Somewhere, Cupid's on stress leave. 50. A man once called 911 because the TV remote wasn't responding. He said, "It's clearly broken. I've tried yelling." The dispatcher, probably contemplating a new career, told him to change the batteries. He said, "I already did, 3 years ago." At this point, the operator might have just muted the call and screamed into the void. Imagine the bravery it takes to serve the public knowing someone out there is demanding technical support from emergency services. 51. And finally, the crown jewel of human idiocy. A man once called 911 to report himself missing. He said he was trying to find himself and was spiritually lost. When the dispatcher asked for clarification, he said, "I'm right here, but I don't feel present." Somewhere, the operator just stared at the phone, questioning every life choice. And honestly, that's the perfect ending. Because after 51 of these calls, I think we're all a little spiritually lost. Except, unlike him, we know where we are. Somewhere between Wi-Fi, fast food, and absolute rock-bottom genius. Hit like if your phone still works, subscribe for more human disasters, and I'll see you in the next emergency.